Hello and welcome to the TLDR News Podcast. It's our very first episode. We've done a few incarnations of this podcast before, but I think this one's aiming to be a bit more general about UK politics. You know, we did trust issues last year, which was very specific. So we should be here every week from here on out discussing what's been going on in UK politics this week. So I'm joined today by Zac Rory, TLDR's editor-in-chief, and Rory Taylor. What's your title now?
Writer, contributor, personality.
Yeah. Former social media guy.
Yeah. Shouldn't laugh at personality.
Good to be back. Anyway.
Good. Well, it's been a bit of a chaotic weekend. It seems like it's a good time to restart this. We've got a lot to talk about. So shall we start with the Boris Johnson saga? So we'll talk about the honours list. Should we do that?
Yeah, sure.
Start with that.
Well, there's sort of two parallel stories.
There are. So if we start with the honours list and then we'll move on to Priveleges committee.
Okay.
So do either of you want to give a summary or do you want me to give a summary?
Why don't you give a summary?
Okay. So essentially a week last Friday, I think it was, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, met with Boris Johnson at Boris Johnson's insistence. Rishi Sunak didn't really want to talk about the honours situation. But Boris Johnson sort of insisted on it. Effectively, Boris Johnson has his resignation honours, so he can nominate some of his key allies to, knighthoods, nominate them to the House of Lords. It was quite a controversial one. There was some people were suggesting that he was nominating about 100 people, including maybe even his own father. That didn't end up happening. It was a lot fewer than that. But there were three names, three of his key allies that were nominated to the House of Lords. So that was Nadine Dorries, Alok Sharma and Nigel Adams. Now, there's a weird quirk with this is that for them to be able to go to the House of Lords, they have to resign as MPs within the next 6 months. They decided that they weren't going to do this because it would cause a by-election, which might be a bit humiliating for the Tories at the minute, given how far behind they are in the polls. They'd likely lose. They thought they were doing this as in this meeting, it was Johnson thought he'd acquired a quid pro quo with the Prime Minister, that if they decided to push that a little bit further along and didn't resign, causing these by-elections, that Rishi Sunak would appoint them to the House of Lords at a future date. Yeah. He didn't do that. So Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams resigned in protest. This sort of kicked this whole thing off. So what are your, do either of you have any particular takes on this, what this could mean going forwards, especially these by-elections that are about to happen?
Well, I was just going to quickly say on the honours list thing, it's funny how obviously it started out 100 names or so, very controversial. Even the smaller, shorter list that ended up going through is still packed with allies of Boris Johnson and those who, a lot of his staff who are implicated in Partygate stuff, now going into the House of Lords. Including there's a 29-year-old former political staffer. She's going to the House of Lords now. She's the youngest ever life peer, and she spent about
life peer.
Ooh. So age 29, she's going to be a legislator forever for the rest of her life, unless they abolish the House of Lords.
So jealous.
Yeah, it's pretty good, isn't it?
God, imagine 5 years' time being a Lord. God, that'd be good.
Yeah. The list, if you ignore the Nadine Dorries stuff, is controversial in and of itself, but. On the by-elections, it's not looking great for the government based on polling and history, I guess. Lib Dems and Labour are already kind of whirring up their by-election machines in the hope of inflicting a triple defeat on the government, and it's exactly what Rishi Sunak was hoping to avoid, but it's happening anyway.
Well, the interesting thing here is that Rishi Sunak had effectively gone into this meeting. Some reports have said that he was deliberately sort of vague with Johnson, and it seems that he's kind of it looks like he's trying to portray it as he's won, but realistically he's still got 3 by-elections that he's almost certainly about to lose in quite a humiliating fashion. What do you think about that, Zac? Do you think he's actually played his hand particularly well or not?
I sort of think, to Sunak's credit here, I think there wasn't really any other way to play it. I think that there was always going to be a spat here because Johnson's honours list was always too controversial for its own good. And Johnson was always asking too much of Sunak. He was essentially asking Sunak to overrule the appointments committee. And that was always going to be controversial. And Sunak's line, what he's trying to say is that he just wasn't involved with this. So Sunak's line is that he was just following what the House of Lords Appointments Committee told him to do, and that he was never agreeing to any quid pro quos, to never going to delay any peerages for Nadine Dorries or anything like that. He was just going to follow exactly what the House of Lords Appointment Commission told him to do. And yeah, and I think that actually, as it goes, that's pretty good defensive line if you're going to get into sort of a shit slinging fight with Boris Johnson. And it does sort of remove him from the whole thing, and it sort of lines up quite nicely with the character he wants to play in this battle. He wants to be the adult in the room, and he wants Johnson to look like the sort of petulant loser. And if he can just say, listen, I was just doing as I was told, I didn't want to get into the politics of all this, and Johnson is making various sort of slightly convoluted allegations, then Sunak can look a little bit removed, and he can look just a little bit more adult, really.
As public relations goes, I think you're absolutely right. I think that this is building into the sort of Rishi Sunak is the adult in the room, all of that. I think he's played that very well. But at the end of the day, he still has these 3 by-elections, which will reflect on Sunak, where he,
Sure, but I think that was always going to... Well, maybe not always, but I think he was always going to face at least a by-election, however this panned out. There's always going to be either Johnson's or Dorries, or one of them was going to resign. If he overruled the House of Lords Appointment Commission, for example, then Dorries would have... Well, I don't know if they would have banned that one, but if basically he said yes to Johnson's original appointments, then he would have faced by-elections anyway. This way, he goes into the by-elections with the line that this is all Johnson's doing. I was just doing as I was told. But you're right. I mean, it's not an easy position for Sunak, and I think the difficult thing for him is that in fighting back against Johnson, there is an electoral advantage to that because Johnson is politically toxic, and the electorate really, really don't like him. But the main risk, and Sunak sort of basically pitching himself in contrast to Johnson, is probably a good move. He has quite a lot to gain electorally by sort of pitching himself as the non-Johnson, the opposite to Johnson, the antidote to Johnson. But the big risk he runs, obviously, is he runs the risk of sort of exacerbating the pre-existing divisions within the parliamentary party, and how that affects the Conservatives' wider electoral chances in the future is really an open question.
Yeah, I think that's the really interesting point, is how this affects the Conservative Party more generally, because Sunak has, to his credit, for the last few months, certainly since becoming Prime Minister, been trying to repair a very, very damaged party. And the chaos of last year seems to have subsided slightly. And what this risks is undoing a lot of that. It's still an open question as to what happens, and I think it all sort of depends on what Johnson does next.
Yeah.
In the video that should be coming out alongside this, we explain the options that Johnson has, but I think that certain of those options, risk dividing the party a lot more.
Yeah, I think Sunak's been lucky in that for the last few months, Johnson has made these kind of little digs against Rishi Sunak, but Sunak's been able to kind of just ignore them because he just, gets on with his job and ignore Boris Johnson, whereas now it's
just stopping the boats. He's doing what he's supposed to be doing.
5 key pledges.
Bringing down inflation, stopping the boats.
But now Boris Johnson has kind of, done the nuclear option of resigning. Like, it's unavoidable now, this inter-party war.
Well, should we move on and talk to it's important just to differentiate these, which is that the resignations of Nadine Dorries and Nigel Adams were very much to do with this, the honour system. Yeah. Whereas Johnson's resignation seems to be slightly different, because this is relating to the Partygate investigation from the Priveleges Committee. So
I'll jump in and do a brief history of Partygate. No, basically, for a while now, the Priveleges Committee, made up of cross-party MPs, has been investigating whether Boris Johnson knowingly and recklessly misled the House of Commons when he repeatedly said they were always following the rules at Downing Street during the pandemic. Johnson, he's been kind of making his case to the committee that he didn't lie to Parliament, whatever. It all came to a head on Friday, when the Priveleges Committee sent Johnson their kind of draft report, and in that they said that they were going to recommend that he would be suspended from the House of Commons for a period more than 10 days. I don't actually know if we know the exact period.
We don't. It's suggested it's at least above 10. Some are suggesting it's about 20, but we don't know yet.
But the fact that it would have been above 10 days would have meets the conditions for a recall petition, which can...
Well, assuming it's approved by the House of Commons.
Yeah, that's the key thing. It has to be approved by the whole House, but majority, assuming it would be... Yeah, whole as in all MPs votes on it. Yeah. That's all right. Assuming that happened, it can pave the way to a by-election, which polling suggests Johnson would probably lose to Labour. So he saw that, realised there was a good chance that he would be suspended and face a by-election, and decided rather than do that, he would resign with immediate effect. Not actually immediate effect, because technically he's still an MP, but We don't need to go into that. Anyway, he would resign rather than face all of that.
Yeah.
And in his resignation statement, he launched this massive attack against the committee, accusing it of being a kangaroo court, saying they're always out to get him, they've got no evidence, they've stitched him up. It's part of a plot to take him down, quite Trumpian style. It was. I mean, he's been critical of the committee before, but this was like a full broadside attack on it, basically.
We don't know exactly what's in the report yet, but the suggestions that they have accused Johnson of a contempt of Parliament in the committee hearing itself, which is, that's in addition to potentially misleading the House as well, which is why they have recommended a suspension of more than 10 days.
Yeah.
I think an important thing to note on that as well is that, as with all committees in the House of Commons, they are representative of the composition of Parliament. So the Tories have a majority at the minute, so this whole idea that it's a kangaroo court is led by Conservative, or
the chair is Harriet Harman, Labour MP, and Johnson mentioned that quite a lot in his letter, saying she was kind of leading this.
But it's not a Labour committee.
Exactly.
It's a nonsense on so many levels. That I mean, like the idea that a kangaroo court allows you to use taxpayer money to pay the most expensive KC in the UK to defend your case. That's a classic like kangaroo Uganda stuff. Like what a joke.
He was saying a small group of people were forcing him out when actually the steps to him getting removed from the House of Commons involves the cross-party committee recommending the suspension, House of Commons, Conservative majority approving of that, enough of his constituents signing a petition and then voting him out in a by-election. That's not a small group of people forcing him out.
That's why he quit. That's why he quit, as opposed to do the whole he jumped before he was pushed, because it's a lot easier to paint yourself as a martyr if you just have the committee, whereas
rather than your constituents.
The entire House of Commons and then your constituents. In which case you just look like a dickhead.
It's also worth noting as well that he won like one of the biggest majorities since the late 90s for the Conservatives. It's a huge Conservative majority still. Especially if you compare back to the slim majority of David Cameron post 2015, Theresa May, etc. It's still very Conservative dominated in the House of Commons. And as we pointed out, for him to be suspended, it requires a vote in the House of Commons. So if it went to a simple vote and his own party backed him, he wouldn't have been suspended. I mean, I know that the convention is that they will just agree with the committee.
If we'd have got to the stage where they had a vote, that would have been interesting.
Very interesting.
And there would have been, Tory party civil war probably over that as well, based on the Johnson allies voting against it. And then
interestingly, I think they would have actually survived that. So I think that would have been very similar situation to what happened with the Windsor Framework thing, where there was a lot of chatter about a Johnson rebellion.
Just small rebels.
Like 20 of them before they realised that wasn't the place to fight. I think the interesting thing about what's happening now is Johnson has to pick his moment to fight the fight.
Yeah.
Because what you have is the vast majority of the Conservative Parliamentary Party are sort of soft Sunakites. And they aren't ideologically aligned with Sunak, but they prefer him to Johnson because they think he's their best chance of keeping their seats at the next election. And while that's still true, Johnson can't really challenge Sunak.
No.
So he has to find a convenient point in time where he can convince enough of the parliamentary party, a sort of critical mass, that actually Sunak's not going to win them the next election. And I don't think that would have been the time. I think that he would have been fine. What I think is interesting is how he responds to the by-elections, because by-elections are always pretty tough for incumbent governments, and they've proven particularly tough in this parliament. And if Sunak loses, let's just say all three, because two of those, Mid-Bedfordshire and the other one.
Selby and somewhere.
That's the one. Yeah, there we go. We're political gurus here.
Yeah.
Those should be safe Tory seats. If he loses both of those, then you might see that sort of like a little bit of momentum for Johnson in the parliamentary party. Although, whether or not he can capitalise on that will fundamentally depend on how stupid the parliamentary party is. Because while you might get a little bit of wavering, if they see some bad results and people might be going, well, maybe we should return to Johnson. I mean, it's just objectively a bad idea. Like the polling suggests that Johnson is just not popular in the wider public. And another sort of internal row is not what the Tory party needs, especially this close to the next general election.
It is incredible how Johnson he's fully bought into the myth of his own popularity, I think.
Yeah.
And by avoiding this by-election, he has avoided an opportunity for him to possibly learn something about his own popularity, because the last electoral thing he actually faced was 2019. He won a massive majority. Since then, he's managed to kind of convince himself that he is still incredibly popular with the country when polling just doesn't back that up.
And the 2019 election was, months after he became leader.
Yeah.
He wasn't tried and tested as a prime minister
Yeah.
at that point. He's never faced an election on his record, really. So I think you're right. I think he is still under this interpretation that he's still 2019 Boris, when that is just not true. There's been so much that's happened since then. I think just going back slightly as well, I think the interesting thing is, and I think we'd spoken about this before, was whether the committee would recommend more than a 10-day suspension. And I think that we at least had said it's probably unlikely that they were going to suggest a more than 10-day suspension. And if you look at other MPs that have been suspended from the House of Commons, when you get onto things about lobbying, cash for access, those kind of things, they don't really get that close to 10 days. So it had to be something quite big. And I think that contempt of Parliament was the compounding factor that pushed it over the 10-day thing. If he didn't go in with all this bravado and some of the things he said in committee, which was televised and we all saw, was kind of ludicrous, some of the things that he was claiming.
The people with the power to get you kicked out of Parliament, you generally would want to keep them on your side, possibly, but I guess his strategy was going all guns blazing.
Yeah. It was some of the stuff was. I mean, one of the things he claimed was that I genuinely believe that it was necessary for me to honour people who are leaving with a big leaving do in COVID. It's like your post and everything else was telling people not to. It's ridiculous. But so I think if he'd have played committee better, he probably wouldn't have had this suspension and he'd still be in Parliament.
I agree, yeah. I think it's weird because I think that there is a kernel of truth to the Johnson thing, that the Johnson's excuses, in that, sure, it depends on how you read what he said, but he did almost sufficiently caveat his comments in Parliament originally to provide him with a veneer of plausible deniability. Yes. It was all about he didn't make any specific claims about what happened. It was just sort of what I was told. So he said, I've been told this, I've been told that. So that he just pushes the blame onto the next person. Yeah. And I think you're right. Had he not sort of done what he did within the committee, he might well have got away with it.
Yeah. So just to finish up on then, what do we think Johnson's going to do now? So now he's out of Parliament. There's been some tentative suggestions that he might try and run in one of these other constituencies, perhaps mid Bedfordshire, which, I think that was floated a lot on Friday, and then on Saturday people sort of realised that CCHQ will obviously block that if he tries to do that. So I presume both of you are writing that off immediately.
I don't think it's happening.
I
was going to say, I think if he genuinely wants to return as leader, he's better off waiting until the next election, standing for a seat like Henley, which is his old seat, which is open at the next election, standing there, getting elected, assuming the Conservatives lose badly, Rishi Sunak will be replaced. He can run in that leadership election and become leader again. I don't think that will happen, but I think that's his best option. But his whole political career has been a series of making moves to make people think that you're going to do something and then not actually doing it. Like with when after the Brexit vote, when he came out and said, I'm not going to run for the leadership. And then last year, after Liz Truss resigned, him getting all these signatures and then saying, actually, I'm not going to run for the leadership. He really kind of baits people into thinking he's about to make a move and then backs out. So I think he's more likely to wait it out.
Do you think he does that because he wants to try and gauge support for him? Do you think that this is some sort of because I think a lot of it, not to try and dive too deep into his personality or something, but I think there is a thing about approval with him that kind of goes through, that underpins all of this. I think that the party stuff...
This is starting to sound very Westist politics here. A little bit of Johnson psychoanalysis.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Yeah. Maybe I have been listening to it too much.
He might like the fact that he can say, I'm not the leader because I chose not to run, not because I got beaten by someone. But
he did... When... Liz Truss went, he did say something along those lines
I could have won.
I had the signatures, I could have won, but I decided not to. I think he quite likes being able to say those things. So you're all in agreement he's probably not going back to Parliament in the next 6 weeks, in these by-elections.
Not.
So what's he going to do between now and the next election, do we all think?
Well, I think that's one option, is that he stands on the sidelines as a sort of media opposition figure, gets a column in the Telegraph, maybe becomes editor at the Telegraph, and then just throws mud at Sunak for the next couple of years and then runs again. The other possible outcome is that he creates a new party, which is something that's sort of been floated multiple times over the past couple of months. It's interestingly something actually today Nigel Farage said he was open to. So Nigel Farage today said that he'd been talking to, as always, people close to Boris Johnson. I mean, who the fuck isn't close to Boris Johnson these days? And that he'd been pitching the idea. And so that'd be quite something, wouldn't it? And sort of Farage Johnson ticket. The only reason I think this is possible is I don't think Johnson would actually want to be in opposition for 5 years.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing that makes me doubt the plan of coming back as leader of the opposition after 2024 once Sunak has lost, because that would imply waiting until 2029 to actually just be a minor politician.
I think he, in some ways, I don't know.
I think he's deluded enough to think that he would be able to
force an election.
Yeah, something like that.
Equally, I think he's deluded enough to think that he could win a substantial minority in Parliament if he started his new party. So I think that's the fastest way of getting there. And in his mind, that probably gets him the most power because he wins a sort of like majority denying minority in Parliament, forces coalition negotiations, puts in some wild policies as like a prerequisite for any coalition with him, something like that. Yeah, I sort of see that as a possibility. The only thing I'll say, I think the last thing to say about this is just that this is phenomenal news for Labour. I think it's phenomenal news for Labour for two reasons. One, most obviously, it restarts that internal psychodrama that has damaged the Tory brand so much. I mean, they've gone, their reputation as sort of like a ruthless electoral winning machine is just in the dust. Like they now just look like a bunch of divas. And then the other reason I think this is sort of understated. The reason I think it's really bad news for Sunak especially is that an full-on warfare between Sunak and Johnson corners Sunak politically, because one of the attack lines that Johnson uses is that Sunak is not following through on the commitments made in the 2019 manifesto. So stuff like levelling up, stuff about the boat stuff. But the problem with that is that means that Sunak really is cornered into his particular managerial brand of politics. Sunak, the second that Sunak opens up and tries something a little bit more, let's just say like fiscally generous, it looks like he's sort of conceding levelling up to Boris Johnson. Do you see what I mean? And I think that's one of the sort of understated effects of that, is it means that Sunak is now sort of restricted to his basically reheated Osbornism, sort of Cameroon-style managerialism. And the fundamental problem with that is that there just is not sufficient electoral support in the UK to win a majority on that policy base. Whereas for the Conservatives, I think it's something that Boris Johnson was just correct in identifying. The only way they can win a majority these days is with some sort of cross-class coalition, and that does require something like levelling up. But Sunak now doesn't have the political space to go there because Boris Johnson has made that sort of policy, that general sort of focus on regional disparity and being more fiscally generous than the Tories used to be, at least under David Cameron. He's made that his political territory. And the second that Sunak goes over there, it, in some sense, I mean, it doesn't, but it seems to vindicate Johnson. And so I think that's one of the understated consequences of all this.
So Keir Starmer is possibly the luckiest leader of the opposition in history. Couple that with Nicola Sturgeon being arrested and the SNP collapse.
We didn't even talk about that.
He's had a very good week. Keir Starmer has.
Well, we'll have to see what happens in the next week. And we'll be back next week, probably not Monday, but sometime next week to discuss this. So this should be a regular weekly thing from now on. And hopefully we'll be able to discuss...
Backed by popular demand.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. We'll be able to discuss these by-elections when they come around as well.
Excellent.
So thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ben.